Joe Rogan is one of the most famous men on planet Earth. As the host of the most popular podcast on the market and the primary voice of the UFC's broadcast team, Rogan has become a totally unavoidable presence in everyday life.
He's the world's most famous podcaster, a comedian with a global audience, a lifelong martial artist, and of course, the UFC's color commentator.
And in this case, Joe even has managed to make some enemies of the athletes whose fights he calls on a regular basis. This is why UFC fighters hate Joe Rogan, the truth. Tony Ferguson. In fact, as his UFC career has progressed, this lightweight legend has more of a habit of being more and more unapologetic as his general attitude towards the media and the fans. Tony Ferguson isn't exactly the hardest person in the world to piss off. McCoy these days is completely fearless when it comes to taking aim at doubters and haters. Knowing that he is a major fan favorite who is loved by many for his unfiltered approach to the fight game, according to Ferguson himself, it was not that simple. And while the vast majority of those turned in for a showdown with the current lightweight champion Charles Oliveira would agree that Do Bronx well and truly dominated from the start to finish. According to El Cacoy, he prefers to watch the fights without sound in order to avoid the bias of the commentary team. Speaking to Ariel Helwani during an episode of the MMA Hour, Tony explained how Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier played a huge part in setting the narrative that came out of the fight. To add to this, Ferguson also said that while he was interested in making an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience at one point in time, he's not anymore. In his own words, the guys in the broadcast booth gang up on the fighters they don't like, painting a picture of the fight that works against them. He also used this opportunity to throw shade at Daniel Cormier, who is, of course, the teammate of his longtime rival Khabib Nurmagomedov.
You can actually see the fights better. I recommend anybody to do that. If you look at the commentary, if you watch my Oliveira fight without the commentary, because what ends up happening is the commentary gang up on people that they don't like. But because of that, obviously, you probably got bent out of shape on that one. You know, like I said, I never did a Joe Rogan interview before. You know, I might. You know, and obviously when Cormier, you know, when Khabib, and, you know, I make my comments about fathead and not making weight. It must be a team thing, man. Those guys shit on scales. I don't understand it.
Frank Mir. This legend of a heavier weight class has some of the most legendary victories in the history of the UFC. To kick things off, we're going straight back to old school with a word from the former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir. But none come more impressive than the time he became the first fighter to ever submit the insanely talented BJJ black belt Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Mir actually became the first person to knock Nogueira out as well, finishing him with strikes in their first showdown. But what a lot of people might not know is prior to that fight, which was in fact a rematch, so where does Joe Rogan fit into all of this? Joe alluded to the fact that Big Nog had suffered a staph infection that led up to his loss to Mir. Well, after his first fight with Mir, Nogueira returned to the octagon in hopes of recapturing his momentum, and during the commentary for that fight, in his own words, all fighters are fighting from some form of injuries or illnesses that led to fights, some minor, some major. Now, in Frank Mir's opinion, this is almost a form of an excuse making on the part of Rogan, and he criticized the commentator for trying to force a narrative that was a bit softer on the Brazilian. Thankfully, his incredible Kimura submission on the Big Nog in the rematch saw him stamp down his authority on their rivalry. And for Joe to come out and say that, according to Mir, put a downer on what was a huge win.
I actually didn't get to watch him firsthand too much. I was getting a little bit of artwork done on my back, so I got some texts, so obviously I got him DVR'd so I could go home and watch him. The only thing that kind of upset me was I heard that, don't want to say too much, fighters for why they perform badly. You know, Rogan is making a lot of excuses for certain. Every fighter has reasons why we don't perform at 100%. That's always disheartening to me, just for the reason being that ever sitting and complaining that I think as fans, we don't want to hear heroes or warriors almost died from staph or anything else. I think that's pretty sad and pathetic.
Ronda Rousey. As soon as her winning streak came to an end in a truly shocking fashion at UFC 193, media appearances where MMA was discussed were few and far between as far as Ronda Rousey was concerned. Ronda pretty much shut herself off for the media, refusing to take any questions that related to her very noticeable decline. In fact, when she did make her return to the cage, Rousey insisted that she get a total exemption from media duties, something that had never been done before. In the wake of her head kick knockout defeat of Holly Holm, Conor McGregor, in all of his superstardom, had demanded the exact same thing just a few months before, but Rousey, who was always a favorite of Dana White, got her media exemption in the end and pulled out of the UFC 200 and falsely retired because he didn't get his way, and basically said that fighting wasn't about how famous you are or how many appearances on the hit TV show Entourage you had made. During this time, Joe Rogan was forced to admit that he had overhyped Ronda. The way she stormed off the stage without letting Joe interview her at UFC 207 pre-fight stare-downs tells you all you need to know. Well, if you needed any proof that Rousey heard these comments and did not appreciate them one bit, Chael Sonnen. When it comes to generating controversy and stealing headlines, no one, and we repeat no one, does it better than Chael P. Sonnen. It could sometimes be difficult to tell whether Chael Sonnen actually has beef with someone or if he's simply playing the whole thing up for the cameras on Colby Covington's act. So when the bad guy went on the offensive against Rogan after the commentator seemingly pulled the curtain back, telling the world it's not real, criticizing Rogan for outing Colby even though the whole world was in on it, Sonnen acted like it was the most shocking thing that he had ever heard. Joe, in return, seemed a bit baffled by the whole thing, making it clear Sonnen was far from impressed. All in all, this whole beef settled down just as quickly as it began, and as far as we know, these two MMA icons are back on decent terms. That he had no idea whether Chael was fully serious or not.
What Chael does? No, that I talked about what Colby does, and he's selling pay-per-views.
And why is he mad at you? Because you're taking away the fourth wall?
Because I'm giving up the secrets of the business. I go, he's having fun. I go, he's playing up the role of the villain. It's the dumbest shit of all time. Meanwhile, he's giving up the secrets of the business by talking about me giving up the secrets of the business. It's so ridiculous.
Chris Cyborg. And while we all know the story of Rogan, Dana White, and the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe making fun of Cyborg live on air, if there's anyone on this list who has a good reason to hate Joe Rogan, it's the legendary featherweight Chris Cyborg. Joe basically pulled up a clip of Cyborg powerlifting and spoke about her relationship with the comparatively huge Gabby Garcia. The very direct steroid insinuation made by Rogan during an episode of his podcast were too heavy to ignore. It wasn't the first time Rogan had taken shots at the Brazilian, and it wouldn't be the last. When the clip was over, Joe spoke about how Cyborg had tagged Garcia before, joking that the two shared the same doctor. By the way, the featherweight legend eventually left the UFC. It was clear that things weren't exactly on good terms. She would later refer to Rogan as a bully. The history books will show that Chris Cyborg was subjected to a truly unusual amount of abuse from those under the UFC banner, and by these days it appears as though she's a lot happier fighting in Bellator. Out of all the fighters who have held championship belts in the UFC,
they tested her because they had 3 world title fights lined up for her. She passed on 3 world title fights. She said she couldn't make it in 8 weeks at 145, which is the weight class that she asked for. And whether or not they were going to test her anyway, who knows? But that's when they tested her, and that's when she pissed hot.
It makes sense.
And so then they gave her more weeks, and they gave her they gave her a 3rd test, and they're like, something. And she did not reveal before that that she was taking that.
Tyron Woodley. Sure, he's a pretty underrated fighter and champion. Tyron Woodley, the most likable character in the world? Well, it depends. Faith the fans had in him prior to his pretty forgettable fights, but over the years, his tendency to constantly complain saw him lose a lot of the good with Stephen Thompson and Damian Maia. But Woodley couldn't help but chime in with accusations of bias on the part of the UFC commentary team. And after Israel Adesanya's incredibly slow performance against Yoel Romero, breaking the record for least amount of strikes thrown in a title fight, Joe Rogan was the one who came under fire, with Woodley saying that he found it odd no one had mentioned anything about the last style bender. Most people are pretty quick to take shots at Woodley because they find him annoying, a record that Tyron himself once held. See a popular star like Adesanya thrown into some category as a more divisive one like Woodley. But to his credit, it does seem unlikely that the UFC would be as happy to see Conor McGregor. In following his instant classic UFC 202 rematch with Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor is far from the only fighter to call out Joe Rogan for bias in his work from the commentary desk, was getting too far excited about relatively uneventful flurries from Nate Diaz. There were more than a few McGregor fans who thought that Joe, in particular, for the most part a few years later, he would speak up saying that he wished that Joe would call the fight more naturally, instead of calling it a script. And though Conor himself was pretty quiet on this subject, Rogan in response seemed pretty confused by this, taking it as an accusation of him reading from a literal script. His reactions to Conor McGregor's 3 knockdowns of Diaz when compared to Nate's largely block combos tells the whole story in some fans' eyes. But if we had to guess, we'd imagine that if Conor was actually watching, he'd see this as a bit of a deflection. It did go on to say that UFC fighters in general hate listening to commentary of their own fights.
What did he say? Something like,
call fights on a script. Talk off script.
I talk off script?
Talk on script. Or
well, I mean, I don't know what exactly he said, but maybe he just didn't like my commentary. I bet he likes it when he wins. That is not really true because no one ever gives me a script. That's a fact.
Khabib Nurmagomedov. The night that he first touched UFC gold, his UFC 223 clash with Al Iaquinta, something quite strange happened. Khabib might get nothing but major praise from Joe Rogan these days. He was so comfortable, in fact, that he seemed to take some time off to show his newly perfected jab mid-fight. The Eagle was at his dominant best against the short-notice replacement opponent in front of him, but instead highlighting totally insignificant shots from Iaquinta instead, call it getting caught up in the moment if you want. But when all was said and done, the fans started to notice that Joe Rogan was insanely dismissive to some of the big moments from Nurmagomedov. It was clear that Joe wasn't doing his job correctly, and explained just how difficult it can be to keep a level head in the middle of a title fight. He would later put out a statement apologizing to Khabib. The fight, if you watch it without paying any heed to the commentary, was just about as one-sided as any fight in Khabib's catalog. All in all, you could understand if Khabib was angry about his major UFC moment being undersold like this. And though Iaquinta did well and survived, it showed himself to be as tough as ever. It shouldn't have been a big talking point, that's for sure.